Hey friends, welcome to this video. We are talking about type hints in Python. And this is first going to start out with running some Python code that does not use type hints. Then we're going to insert some type hints, see how the experience from the developer angle changes once we have type hints in the picture. And let's dive in. So to start things out, we have two functions we're going to define. We have multiply values. This is just taking in x and y as arguments and then multiplying them together. We have divide values, which takes in x and y and divides x by y. All right, so let's define these functions and let's use them. So multiply values. As a developer, all I know is I'm supposed to pass in x and y. And just to be facetious here, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to pass in a string of text as y. All right, let's see how this works out for me. And it actually works. In Python, you can do this. You can multiply a string of text by a number, and you get that string of text repeated that number of times. Okay, so no big deal. We have divide values. We divide 6 by 10. We get the expected output. And now we're going to simulate a very, very basic version of sequential logic where we define a variable, then we're going to use that variable in another function. And this is going to help us see one of the first annoying things that might happen when you're working with someone's code who doesn't use type hints. I can tell you right now, I am extremely frustrated with a library that I'm trying to adapt for my own uses. I'm using some code from there, extracting it and modifying it for my own use, and the developer didn't use type hints. And so all over the place, I'm seeing these variable names and I'm like, I don't know what the hell this thing is supposed to be. Is this supposed to be a dictionary? Is this supposed to be a list? So, is this just a string of text? And all of that confusion could be avoided if you just told me what I'm supposed to pass in and what I can expect to get as output from a function. So when you don't use type hints, you're prone to errors like this, where really the problem is we used a function in a way that the developer probably didn't intend this function to be used. Multiply values. Probably most people would assume this is going to be numbers that you pass in, but there's really no way for me to know I'm using this function wrong by passing in a string. There's no indication, there's no warning, there's no IDE help that's identifying this is a bad thing to do. And so I do this and it's legal up here on this line, but then because I use this function in an unexpected way, later on that becomes a problem. And now the troubleshooting begins. And this is very annoying. Oftentimes as a developer, you have to go trace everything and say, okay, if I give this input into the function, I get this output. Are both of those things what I expect? Okay, so this is not ideal. And let's see how type hints can kind of help us prevent that annoying thing from happening. So with type hints, what you pay as a developer is a little bit of upfront planning and a little bit of extra code. You can see it's not so strenuous though. We're just saying instead of passing in x and y, I expect you to pass in x as a number, floating point number. So this could actually be a whole number or a decimal number. Y should be a number as well. And then I'm going to, if you honor this contract, I'm going to give you back a number. Then for divide values, we do the same thing. Let's see how this changes our world. So down here, we can see the IDE is already coloring the Y definition a little bit differently than before. Before, there was no indication that anything is smelling a little bit funny in this, this usage of the code. But now if we hover over this, we can see because the IDE is smart enough to know what types the functions are expecting, it gives me a little bit of a warning here in the user interface saying, hey, we expected a float, but we got a string instead. So that's really helpful because it lets me know, as someone who's using these functions, that I'm not using this quite as it was intended. Now, that might still be fine. So Python is a dynamically typed language. I can ignore type hints if I want, but at my own peril. So we'll still run into the problem we had before, where this exception gets thrown later on in our logic, and it doesn't get thrown at the stage of the logic where we misused a function. So type hints are nice. They help us see things. They give us suggestions on what we should be doing as developers, but they don't enforce the types that are defined in the type hints. Now, if you do want to enforce type hints, one way you can do it is to use the type guard library. So type guard allows us to import this type checked decorator, and we can decorate our functions like a Christmas tree over here. And we have now said that this function is going to be type checked. What does that mean? It means that this definition here of x being a numerical value and y being a numerical value are going to need to be honored, or else this function is going to fail loudly. So let's see what this means when we try to run this line of code. So we still have type hints. We're still passing in a string for y when it should be a number. But now instead of Python just letting that happen, it's going to throw an exception. It's going to say, we received we have this type of argument y, which must be either float or int, and you gave us a string instead. Okay, so we did not honor the contract, therefore no deal is going down. Python just says, nope, this is where we stop. You need to pass in the correct types to these functions for us to move any further. This is actually desirable in a lot of production environments. For me, I work a lot with different systems. So Python isn't the only programming language in the picture. You might be receiving inputs from different systems. You might be providing outputs to different systems. And rather than writing some messy code or some disorganized, non-structured, non-consistent code, what you want is to know, I'm always going to be receiving these types. I'm always going to be working with these types. I can use certain libraries, certain functionality that only work on these types, and then I will always have a consistent output that I can guarantee in this contract is going out to this other system. So that's my world. So I really love enforcing types, but it's not for everyone. But it is good to know that if you need to, you can enforce these types. And what that's also going to do for you is now when you try to go through this logical flow down here, you're going to, before you ever get to the stage where divide values would fail, you're going to fail at this stage where you first violated the contract of the types that are expected. This is really, really useful when you're in an environment where you need to rely on logs or looking at your stack trace errors in order to find out, okay, we have a bug in production. What do we need to fix to make that bug go away? It's really annoying when that bug pops up someplace where the problem is not actually related to the code being executed there. It's much better to have systems in place, processes in place that are going to fail loudly at the point where the problem is introduced, rather than letting that problem marinate and then pop up later where there's actually nothing wrong with the function divide values. That's just where if you're lazy with the types you're passing around in functions, you could end up in trouble and run into a problem here, but really the problem was introduced up here. So that's all I wanted to say about type hints. I think that they're great. I use them all the time. I think that there's never a function that wouldn't benefit from having type hints. And the only question is, do you want to enforce them or not? So I don't always enforce them, but I do when it's really critical that the types be consistent. And hopefully this helps somebody out there avoid a lot of extra debugging that's really unnecessary. So I hope to see you around in future videos.